This is a quick introduction on how people typically use a milling machine, specifically a mini mill machine. I'm going to zoom in on the work area so that you can get an idea of how this is done. Typically with a milling machine you will make parts that perhaps look something like this. They're usually square in nature, and the milling machine shaves off the edges, grooves out grooves like this. And it usually does this, it always does this with something called an end mill. It looks a little bit like a drill bit, but it's, as you see, it's not sharp on the end, it's flat on the end. And this will go in and perhaps groove this out. And it can also cut the metal this way to give these edges. As you see, this is how we've made this particular piece. So typically you will take your workpiece. Here I've got a piece of steel. I'm going to put it in the vise. And let's say I just want to shave off some of the material, shave it down a little bit. I would use this end mill to go across there. I will stick it into the collet, as they call it, and then I start turning it. But as I turn it, the shaft is turning, so to hold it steady, I use this device. I stick it in here, and this holds the shaft solid. There's a groove in there. I keep turning it, and now that shaft won't turn because I've got this steel rod stuck in there. So now I can tighten this down because the end mill has to be very, very tight, and the shaft doesn't turn. Before I can start using the machine, I better take this out, because if I don't take this out and I turn the machine on, the motor will stall right away. That's a problem that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So once you have your piece in there, you simply lower the bit down to the work area and then turn on the machine. And you do that with the potentiometer right here. As you see, the potentiometer is facing the front where I can get it at it easily. So I turn it on and the machine starts spinning, and I can lower it slowly onto the work, and then you'll hear it start to cut. And now I can use just set this so that it's just barely touching, and I'll lower it down a little bit more with a fine motor, with a fine lowering wheel. Now it's touching, and now to cut a groove I just use these wheels to move the work back and forth like this. And you see I'm cutting a groove now, very slight groove. What's very important is the speed that this is going. Depending on the type of material you're cutting, if it's aluminum, steel, you want a different speed. In the old days you had to use pulleys to set up the speed. Now with a direct current motor you can just use this to speed it up or slow it down, and this is very important. So as an operator, you want to have access to the potentiometer right here in front of you so that you can set the correct speed. And if this goes down too deep and it jams, you want to be able to stop it very quickly with the emergency stop switch like that. So that's basically what you do with the milling machine. So if we look at the side of the milling machine, you'll see that there just isn't enough space to have the whole controller box on the side where you would need it if you have the potentiometer hooked up to that box, because there just isn't enough space here. If I look from, it could only go from there to about there, which is 150, 140 millimeters. That's okay. It's more the height. We really only have about 110 millimeters to work with, and the box is much bigger than that. So there's just no way to put the controller box on the side. There just simply isn't the room. But we do have to have these controls facing the front so that the end user can use them while he is working from the front and has access, and the end user has to have access to this emergency stop button. Now if we take a closer look at the controller itself, at the back you can see that the red display is showing. The prototype box that I designed shows the display. That's important from the point of view of being able to see error messages. For instance, if you get an overheat situation or something, you want to be able to read that error code. You know, so I turn this button off, the lights disappear and they come back on. But as something to measure the speed of the motor, it's not really that useful because you really can't see it while you're standing at the front. You have to look around the side. It's somewhat useful in the sense that you can set the speed, and you usually don't change the speed much while you're doing your cuts. But people who do want to see the speed of the spindle of the machine will typically install a device that gives them a readout of the actual RPM of the spindle itself. In this case, the RPM that will be displayed on the motor controller will be the same as the spindle speed, because I've set my pulleys at a 1-to-1 ratio. But for this to be really useful, you really have to have the display on the front on the smaller box. So if there was a way to bring that information to the front and put a display there, that would be helpful. So looking at the machine again from the front, I hope you can see why it's important to have this separate box with the potentiometer loaded here. And if we have the power coming out from the controller for the emergency stop switch, we might as well have a power on LED here, because we've got the power there already. If there was a way of bringing the display here using the computer interface or whatever, we could put a readout display here, but that's a nice to have. It's not absolutely necessary. One other thing I will point out is that a very nice feature that I would like to put into this box is a way of preventing jam-ups when people forget to take this lock pin out. It's very common for people to set this up and then forget to take that out, turn it on, and the machine stalls. It's not very good for it. And there's a way in which you can put a switch in here where you must take this and slide this into a slot here to allow the machine to start. And if you don't put this in there, then the machine won't start. It turns the power off. It's a pretty simple thing to do, not absolutely necessary, but it would be a nice feature to have. And I'm thinking of putting that in there as well. So I hope you can see why we need this extra box at the front, and why we cannot have the potentiometer on the controller at the back.